Good
Do you hear that?
afternoon. Hi, we are live on the Women of Welcome. I am so grateful for everybody who's joining us in our webinar today. I'm Sarah Casada, and I oversee our Women of Welcome community. Women of Welcome is, if you're new here, we are a Christian community pursuing compassion and Christ-like welcome toward immigrants and refugees. You can join us on Facebook and Instagram at Women of Welcome. I am so excited to jump in with our guest today. I'm joined by Jenny Yang, who is Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at World Relief, who is one of our partners. So thank you so much for making time today, Jenny. We have a lot to talk about.
We do have a lot to talk about. I feel like there are changes happening all the time, and a lot of the issues I think we care about are flying a little bit under the radar. And so I think it's important to have the conversation and really understand what's going on and figure out ways that we can respond.
Absolutely. I'm going to jump right in because we do have a lot to talk about. But real quick before I do, I just want to welcome everyone who's able to watch us live on Facebook. We're glad you're here. We're glad if you're watching the replay too. If you are here live, feel free to jump in and ask questions in the comments. We will do our best to address them as we go along. So, okay, Jenny. An article recently came out saying that there had been 46 changes in immigration policy since COVID began. And I think there's been at least 2 more since that article came out. And it's just a lot. And it's raised a lot of questions, especially in our community, because we have a lot of moms and grandmas and aunts. And many of us remember when child separation was happening during zero tolerance at the border 2 years ago. And some of the changes and headlines that we've been reading have indicated that this family separation has been reactivated during COVID. And so we just want to start talking about what is happening, how are families being treated at the border and in detention currently.
Yeah, well, I think it's great, again, that we're highlighting what is going on, because a lot of the things that are happening at the border or even in detention facilities are actually flying under the radar. And so this idea of family separation 2.0 has resurfaced because what's been happening over the past few weeks is that several families with their children in detention are being presented with what's called binary choice, an option between the choice between 2 options. The first option is be separated from your child so that your child is not at risk of getting COVID-19. Or if you do remain with your child, then you have to be detained indefinitely in that facility. What happened at the end of April was that Judge Daligi directed ICE to make every effort to promptly and safely release children because of COVID-19. And so a few weeks after that, we started hearing that in certain facilities that ICE was presenting parents with this really awful choice of what the parents can do. From my understanding of the parents that were presented with this choice, the parents, most all of them, have decided to remain with their children in detention, and rather than signing away their children into the custody of ORR. And so that's what we've understand is to be the case. As many of you know, there are over 200 immigrant detention facilities across the country. 3 of those are actually family detention centers. So there's 2 in Texas and there's 1 in Pennsylvania. And there are right now 185 children that are currently being detained with their parents in these family detention facilities. I actually was on a call with ICE to ask them the question of how long these children have been detained, because it wasn't clear to us how long they've been there. And many of these families have actually been locked up for at least 5 months, which is a startling figure, because imagine a child who's 1 or 2 or 3 years old, or of any age really, and then being in a prison-like facility with their parents for up to 5 months. And there is no sense of when these families are going to be released or even what that's going to look like. And so I think this is really concerning, because the baseline protection that we want for children and for immigrant families in general is not to be held in detention facilities. And oftentimes with these immigrants, the only offense that they've committed is violating immigration laws. So they're not criminal offenses. They're just individuals who broke immigration laws. And so we've been advocating at World Relief for especially children and especially these families to be released from detention, that these parents should not have to be faced with a binary choice. especially in the light of the global epidemic of COVID-19. We've been advocating for of release of immigrants that are no flight risks to be placed into local communities.
Let me just stop you for just a second, because there's a few things I want to zero in on. I think about, this idea of parents, and I think I've heard exactly what you've said, that no parent has chosen to be separated from their child. They have, so far, all parents have said, no, my child will remain with me indefinitely in detention. And I think about, for some of us, that feels almost so hard to comprehend, maybe until recently. And I think all of us, with the recent experience, our own country's experience with COVID and being quarantined with our families, and the ways we've seen that. You and I are both moms of young kids, and the conversations that have happened about mental health and about socialization and about education in all of this time that we've had our kids in our home. And you're talking about kids that are being forced to stay with parents in a jail-like, prison-like environment. We've been inside detention centers, and they're very similar to prisons. And just really thinking about that, exactly what you said, that parents are being faced with this awful choice, because you mentioned ORR, which I believe stands for Office of Refugee Resettlement, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
And so what would happen if a parent chose that option?
Yeah, so oftentimes the other option, if you cannot remain with your children, is for your children to be placed within the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR. Now, ORR is the federal agency that is tasked with actually placing these children and doing best children interest determination. So they'll actually talk to the children, do casework for the children, and either place them in foster care systems, or they'll actually try to identify family members within the United States that can actually receive these children. So in many of these cases, the parents have decided against that choice, because what has happened before is that a lot of the children get caught up in the system. They actually are in the custody of ORR for long periods of time, that they're not actually placed with their family members. In some cases, the parents have not been notified where the children actually end up. And so I think
2 years ago, right? The kids went into the ORR system when they were separated at the border 2 years ago. Is that correct?
Right. Yes, that's correct. And so right now, the parents are choosing overwhelmingly to say, well, I don't want my kids caught up in the system where I'm not going to hear from them and actually know what happened to them. I trust them in my care. And so it's better for my kids to be with me, even if it's in detention, than giving them up to the system.
It's exactly what you said. It's a terrible choice. And I think, and this is maybe where you were going, so I want to kind of allow you to share a little bit about, because someone, Catherine even asked in the comments, what's the alternative to detention? And I think that's, I think for sometimes when we're looking from the outside, it's like, well, I mean, you can either put them in this sort of ORR foster care system or keep them in detention. Is there another option? And I'd love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, so immigrant detention has been one of the areas that, in addition to just mass incarceration in general, has been privatized and has led to the profiteering of the detention of immigrants in our community. Just to give you a historical average. So in 1994, there were less than 7,000 people in immigrant detention a day. So less than 7,000. Today, we have over, right now, it's around 26,000 immigrants that are in detention. So that number has almost quadrupled from the mid-1990s of people that we place in detention. So I raised that fact because I think it's important to recognize that back in the 1990s, there was a significant high number of people that were crossing the border, and yet immigrant detention wasn't considered kind of the way to go when it comes to detaining immigrants. And now it's kind of the go-to for immigrants that are in detention. And so
that's right. That was going to be my next question, was like, well, does that mean that people entering the country has quadrupled since the 90s, which I don't believe is the case if you look at the numbers.
Yeah, so if you look at the numbers, I mean, there were high numbers of immigrants that were crossing the border in the 1990s. I think what's happened, though, in the recent years is that the demographics have shifted, where a lot of the individuals crossing are coming from Central America and are more families and children. Whereas back in the early 2000s and late 1990s, a lot of individuals were single males that were coming from Mexico. And so there's various reasons, economic reasons, political reasons, conflict. and persecution that are kind of changing the dynamics of people that are arriving. But one of the things, even at World Relief, we've been saying is alternatives to detention are actually community-based programs in which immigrants can actually wear ankle bracelets or have caseworkers accompany them so that they actually show up in immigration court. In asylum proceedings specifically, over 90% of immigrants that have a court date actually show up for their court hearing, which means that a lot of immigrants want to show up because they want the opportunity to present their case before a legal proceeding. And so this idea that we need to detain individuals because we fear that they're going to either go somewhere or not show up is not borne out in the statistics and in the data. And actually, ICE has had these community-based programs where a lot of immigrants have ankle bracelets as an alternative to detention. They're allowed to live in the community. And again, it's similar statistics where over 90% show up in court proceedings. And it's a lot cheaper to have these alternatives to detention than to actually keep an immigrant detained in a facility.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit specifically about COVID and children who are now approaching the border, whether as unaccompanied minors or potentially with an adult. I think back in May, there was a story that really hit the headlines, and many of us may have read it, but it was about a 10-year-old from Honduras who approached the border alone. His mother was still at the U.S.-Mexico border, and he had family in Houston. And yet the child was deported alone back to Honduras. And the mom at the border didn't even know until a family member in Honduras reached out to her and said, "Your son is here." And so I met recently with the policy directors at KIND, which is Kids in Need of Defense, and they talked about how the U.S. is deporting children alone without so much as even a protection screening to see if they're in any kind of danger, to confirm that the adult that says they're with them is actually the adult that is someone they should be with. And so I think, again, as a mom, I just can't even imagine that whole scenario and the idea of my child being on a plane without me. So want to hear a little bit from you about what has changed, why this is happening at the border right now, what kind of these decisions are made, particularly in this moment of COVID.
Yeah, so I think COVID-19 has overshadowed really any sensibility when it comes to our immigration policies and our immigration laws. And part of it is because of guidance by the CDC, but it's also how the White House and the administration is interpreting such guidance. And so in March of 2020, the CDC basically suspended the introduction of persons that are traveling from COVID impacted areas. And so the Border Patrol took that order and basically started expelling individuals that were arriving into the United States, even if they had a valid asylum claim, and even if they expressed a fear of persecution. And so in April, just a few months ago of 2020, CBP actually reported that they had expelled nearly 21,000 people as a result of this new policy. And actually just last week, at the end of June, they have actually extended this order indefinitely, which means that this inability for people to claim and seek asylum in the United States will continue.
And so they're just turning people away, no questions asked. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So I mean, right now, right. And so I mean, there's some cases that have been able to come through, but for the most part, because of these public health orders, they're also extending the ability for them to basically turn anyone away at the border. And so they've suspended various immigration proceedings. So the MPP hearings that were being held at the border, there was these asylum.
What is, did you say MVP? What is?
Sorry, it's that. It's the Migrant Protection Protocol hearings.
Oh, MVP.
So these are the ones. Yeah. So there were some court proceedings that were set up right along the border. So that's all been suspended. And so it's really alarming right now because I actually can't remember a time in which the border was fundamentally closed in this way, even to those who are fleeing persecution. Because even after an incident of terrorism in this country, right after 9/11, President George W. Bush didn't actually shut down the refugee settlement program or even with asylum. There were still opportunities to do that. And so what's really concerning is that we have laws in the books right now that govern how we're to respond to individuals that are fleeing persecution. And so we have the Flores Agreement, which, well, that's separate, but There's anti-trafficking provisions, which ensures that, especially if you're a minor and you're seeking the protection of the United States, that we have to make sure that you're either not being trafficked or that you're not going to be returned to a situation in which you could be trafficked. And so these are protections that we have, and none of those protocols are being followed because of this immediacy of expelling people from the United States of America. You had mentioned that one case of the boy from Honduras that was deported back to Honduras, likely to a pretty devastating situation. But there's other cases that we know about in which young children are being deported back to situations of extreme violence. So I would say that the deportation of children is not a new phenomenon for the U.S. We've been doing this under many administrations, deporting children. But I think what's new about what's happening now is that they're doing it so quickly, and they're not doing it with proper protocols in place to protect these children. And so oftentimes what would have happened before COVID-19 is that the children likely would have been placed in a few weeks in U.S. shelter until they're released to their mothers or their parents to pursue their asylum cases. But right now, children are not being placed in shelters. They're being immediately deported back. And oftentimes the reason for that is the citation of this global health crisis that we're in.
Well, that's the question I want to ask, because we have some people in the comments that are questioning. So, and I want some clarity on this from you, because are we currently breaking our own laws? And if so, how do we raise the alarm about that? Or is this how we're interpreting provisions related to COVID? And even still, how do we get people involved in that?
Yeah, so I mean, those are great questions, because these are all things that us in the advocacy and policy community are asking is, what law trumps an executive order? Does executive order trump like precedent, like US president? And right now, the public health epidemic means that the executive orders that are being issued by the White House and changes in asylum and refugee law or policy are kind of the public health crisis is superseding that. And so a lot of the deportations that we're seeing because of this decision by the CDC has meant that a lot of these individuals are being returned without a screening because of the CDC guidance that any of these individuals can be carriers of the disease. And so so a lot of the individuals that we're seeing are being deported back. There was around 2,000, I think the New York Times reported, just in the past few months alone, since some of these new policy decisions have come into place. And so it is something that a lot of members of Congress are trying to look into in terms of how do we, on a bipartisan basis, ensure that if there are individuals that are trafficked are not returned to dangerous situations. And then also, I mean, there's things we can do that are in recognition of public health procedures without endangering children, right? So there are shelters that are run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement that are nearly empty. So we can actually, if children are arriving with some kind of claim to asylum or fear of returning home, we can quarantine those children for 14 days. And then there are child welfare laws in all 50 states that require then that that child either be in the safe custody or be reunited with their family. So there's absolutely no reason why we cannot abide by our own laws, and then also make sure that the welfare of children is primary and following through with asylum. So
absolutely, I think that idea of does a public health crisis trump the safety of children is really. It's a both and. It doesn't have to be either or. We can take safety precautions for public health, and we can also follow our procedures. I received a message recently from someone who said, we've been approved as a foster family for unaccompanied minors, and we've yet to have a placement because they're not placing kids that are coming in. And because they're just, like you said, turning them around really. And when I met with Kind recently, that was their biggest concern, was saying, they're turning kids back at the bridges and they're pushing them away from the border, and no one knows what's happening to them because they're not necessarily with an adult. And if they are, no one's checking to see who that adult is in any kind of screening. So I think, we have to really, I think, be vigilant to not let politicians or people tell us it has to be either or. We can do both of these things to protect the vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point because it oftentimes turns into an either or conversation. And I think we've realized that I think the greatest threat to the spread of COVID-19 is not going to be these children. It's going to be how we each individually in our communities take our own precautions, how others in our community are doing that. And so, our government has a responsibility to offer protection and safety for those fleeing persecution. And if we know how to do that for our own communities, we can do that for immigrant communities. So it's not an either or. And so these are the things we're asking for. Certain members of Congress, I think, have been pretty vocal about, pressuring the administration on a bipartisan basis. And so we're hopeful that, well, it's been hard because I think this administration will there's been so many policy changes and they're trying to enshrine it into more policy. And so for us to be vigilant and to continue to humanize and raise these stories is going to continue to be important in this.
Absolutely. And so you've touched on this a little bit, but I want to just ask you directly because I know I've seen people kind of talking about this and different headlines and so many different things, but is our asylum program ending? Is that happening?
Yeah. Well, it's still there. It's not functioning though.
Okay. That's a
And
good way to distinguish.
yeah, and so one of the challenges, there's a couple of challenges. The first is you have those at the border who are trying to come into the United States that cannot enter right now. And so even if they have a valid claim of asylum, they're not being heard. Children are not being granted the protection and assistance that they should have within our system because of COVID-19. And so that remains a challenge for us in responding to the crisis. The other challenge is not just that our border is fundamentally closed, but that those individuals that are currently waiting for asylum in the United States who are already in this country just continue to face significant hurdles in their asylum claims, not just because there continues to be a backlog within the asylum system right now, but because the administration is trying to change the rules of engagement for asylum to make it really, really difficult for someone who's currently here to get asylum. So I mentioned MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocols earlier.
Which is also called Remain in Mexico. Some people
Right.
have heard that as well. So
yes, which is also called Remain in Mexico. And so there's also been policy. So I mentioned that because a lot of the immigrants that were waiting for asylum hearings were stuck in Mexico. And because of that, they're actually not able to go back and forth to attend to their hearings. And so the individuals that are in the United States and that have a court hearing now have to face these new rules of what it means for them to claim asylum. So the administration has changed a couple of parameters. One of them is there's this proposed idea that if you did not try to apply for asylum in Mexico and then you fled into the United States from there, then you cannot qualify for asylum in the United States. The thinking behind that is if you were really desperate and in need of asylum, you would have applied for that in Mexico and not in the U.S. And so you shouldn't be eligible for asylum in the U.S. That's just a false argument because when you look at the asylum system in Mexico, it is virtually non-existent, especially for the numbers of cases that are coming through. And when you consider that a lot of these individuals were not even safe in Mexico, that a lot of them were victims of violence in Mexico, even as they're waiting asylum in the U.S., has meant that Mexico is not necessarily even safe for a lot of these individuals. And the third thing I would say to that is that a lot of the individuals that are seeking asylum actually have family members in the U.S. And so for them to be able to be reunited with family is an important priority for them. And so the administration just recently released a rule that really encompasses a lot of these asylum rule changes into one rule. And so they opened it up for public comment until July 15th. So it would really enshrine this idea of you need to seek asylum somewhere else before coming to the United States. It also reduces the standards or changes the standards by which someone can claim asylum. So oftentimes in certain cases, if you're fleeing gang violence, then you'll be considered for asylum. But the administration is proposing that gang violence, if you flee gang violence, that's not considered fleeing persecution. And so that you actually need to have flood persecution committed by a state, not a non-state actor. And so those are things being considered now as asylum proceedings continue. And so again, I think—
Let me ask you something, Jenny, because some of the things you're describing, the removal of gang violence, and I would also assume domestic violence as not being considered state-sanctioned persecution, as well as this idea that you need to apply in another country before you arrive to the United States. We've heard that over the last few years. So is what you're saying is that they're looking to codify, is that the right word? make that more permanent, or was that already in place? What's kind of changed with that in recent weeks?
Yeah, so I think because the administration is trying to implement everything into this new proposed regulation. Okay. And so before, it was a series of memos and others kind of policy guidance coming from Homeland Security. But right now, what they're doing is making it a proposed rule, which would then be codified. And so you actually have, and the reason for public comment is so that they can, reconsider establishing this rule. And so a lot of individuals have been filing comments. At World Relief, we're considering filing comments as well. And so it really is a comprehensive, sweeping change that we're seeing with this new rule. And again, I think it speaks to the fact that a lot of the changes narrowing asylum and trying to cut off every opportunity for those with valid claims to get asylum has really been continuing and actually grow stronger, I think, with this administration.
Let me ask you about public comments, because that is not something I think I've ever done. And you mentioned World Relief might do it. Is that something that average, everyday women can provide their comments on this new asylum legislation?
Yes, actually. So there is probably a template that we can maybe provide. So everything is in the Federal Register, so it's anyone in the public can comment on this rule. And so there's probably a template that we could provide for you that explains our concerns around this proposed rule. The more people who weigh in, I think the more positive it is. Any individual can do it. Organizations like to weigh in because it's an organizational response to a policy change. But again, I think if you'd like to weigh in on public comments in the Federal Register, we can provide a link for where the rule is, and then also maybe some outlines of ways that we can express our concern.
Yes, I would like to weigh in, and I'm sure many of the women watching this would love to as well. So we'll make sure that after this webinar, I'll work with Jenny that we can get some resources to our Women of Welcome community so that we can participate in the public comments, because yes, I think a lot of that stuff had been done by executive order, and it sounds like they're really trying to move it to more permanence, which can be really damaging to a lot of families. And I wanted to include one. I thank you all so much for commenting and participating. I'm seeing lots of great participation. Pat asked a question of, is there anything in our U.S. immigration law that prevents retroactively affecting people when these new regulations are coming into place, or are people who've been remaining in Mexico trying to follow the law, trying to do everything they've been told, will now be subject to these new changes? How does that work?
Yeah, so right now, a lot of the policy guidance has said that this applies for new immigration cases. So these are individuals that are filing new cases that are coming through. But in terms of the consideration of the grounds for asylum, a lot of that is determined by the immigration judge. And so the immigration judge is part of the Department of Justice. And so they're also getting guidance from the White House in terms of how to interpret these. So it's really DOJ and DHS together that has been promulgating a lot of these policy changes. And so, yes, in certain cases, the new interpretations won't apply if you've already had your case heard before an immigration judge. But for any cases that have not been heard yet, that have a future court hearing, that these are all new considerations as they make some of these determinations. And a lot of groups are actually now trying to figure out through data just how many asylum cases are being negatively impacted by such proposed rule changes or different interpretations of asylum. And we know that asylum rates kind of differ by which court you're in, which precinct you're in. And so these are all things that I think are really important as we think about ways to move forward.
Sure. And how much of the things that you're talking about as far as expelling people at the border and not having the courts, how much is COVID specific and how much of this is going to outlast COVID? I'm assuming when you're talking about this kind of open comment period, that's on legislation that would outlast COVID, if I'm understanding correctly. So what's that balance there?
Yeah, well, the asylum rule that I just mentioned was something the Trump administration, I think, was trying to do for a while. I mean, it's just codifying everything that they have trying to change and want to continue to change within the asylum program. I think what's happening with COVID-19 is that it's adding another layer of just restrictions to just basic protections in the United States. And so I think for a lot of immigration advocates, we're hopeful that with some of the reopening of states because of COVID-19 and things that we would see a lesser restriction on immigration, and that has actually not happened. They're ruling out last week that there's this indefinite kind of delay of the reopening of the border is a demonstration of that. So I think, it's to be determined whether if we have significant improvements in COVID-19, whether we're going to see this relaxation of immigration. I mean, the pandemic, we still have not gotten over. And so I think because of that, we're still going to continue to see significant immigration restrictions. But I do think the voice of our community is really important because I think this narrative that we have to create that we can be safe and then offer refuge is something we can and should be doing right now. And we should not use public health arguments to close the door to those fleeing persecution. And the more we say that, and the more we read these horrific stories of young kids being deported back to conditions that are awful, it just means that I think we have more work to do to just continue to raise the alarm bells and make sure that we continue to offer that protection.
Agreed. I know that the policy advocate for KIND, Kids in Need of Defense, mentioned that, as you just said, I think that the border is indefinitely closed. There's no end date scheduled for sort of reopening border, and yet they are making exceptions for certain people to come and go based on different reasons. And what she was saying is that vulnerable children should be accepted. That they would be a reason why we would allow someone to approach the border if they are a child seeking asylum. We did have a question about if the Department of Justice is able to make statements against the policy changes for asylum.
Yeah, I think that's what we would hope for is or even letters from Congress to say, hey, we've established anti-trafficking laws in order for these situations to be in order for us to make sure, especially in cases like this, that people are not turned away. And I think we've been trying to get that moving in Congress, I would say. The Department of Justice, because of Attorney General Barr and others, it's hard for us to imagine that they're going to go against what the administration wants to do. I know we've had conversations with other folks within ICE and DHS who I think share our sympathies around some family separation issues and deportations, but the overriding influence is the White House. And there are certain people that work within the White House that have had this anti-immigrant, anti-asylum refugee agenda for a long time. And I think the cover of COVID-19 is allowing them to accelerate that agenda, not only with the closure of the border, but making it really difficult for those who are even in the country to gain asylum or immigration benefits generally as well. So yeah, DOJ would be helpful in outlining some of these concerns, but it's probably not likely that they're going to do so right now.
So we've talked a little bit about some of the kind of takeaways. So I just want to recap it, especially if someone joined late. We talked about contributing to public comments on our asylum, these new asylum regulations that the administration is considering, or Congress, I guess, is considering. And so we're going to work to help create some resource for that. For those that are wanting to get involved in helping encourage the release of detainees who don't need to be kept in detention, or families who don't need to be kept in detention for public safety reasons, but could be released because of COVID and different things, as well as the turning away of kids at the border, what's the best action item for that? Is that calling our representatives and just letting them know, hey, these are the things that I'm concerned about? What, if any, are some good action items for those?
Yeah, I think always calling, because immigration is federal policy, is we always have to be that buzz in our congressman's person's ear talking about this. And so, especially for your local representative, to understand our concerns around the turning away of children and the restrictions on asylum is incredibly important. Especially, I would say, if you live in a Republican district, because especially seeing Republicans speaking out on this issue, trying to preserve asylum and refugee space is really, really important. And I think when you reach out to your members of Congress, I mean, sometimes they don't even know, honestly. They don't know what's happening at the border. They're focused on passing, budgets and stimulus packages in Congress. They may not cover these stories. So for us to highlight these stories, to say this is still ongoing, what can you do? And then let them respond and tell us what they're actually doing, I think is critically important. I would also say, even right now with COVID-19, a lot of members are having virtual meetings. And so it's maybe easier for us to do advocacy, because instead of writing letters, trying to get to an office and trying to find the building, go through security, we can reach out and say, hey, can we set up a call with a group of women in this area from this church and talk with you about our concerns? And if we press into that, I think it'd be very, really helpful. So the other thing I would recommend is that a lot of churches have gotten to know your local ICE director. That is the person that a lot of local ICE directors that oversee immigration detention and deportations have, to a certain degree, discretion, right? In the cases of people and the individuals they're potentially deporting. And there's been several churches that have intervened on behalf of immigrants that are in deportation proceedings, and they've been very powerful. Sometimes it hasn't led to them not being deported, but in some cases it has. And so I think any opportunity we have to get to know our ICE directors that are in our communities are helpful, and they're oftentimes pretty responsive to meeting with us and sharing our concerns.
That is really good suggestions. And I just want to sort of underline this idea of reaching out to your congressperson and asking for a meeting, because I think if you had told me that 3 years ago, I would have been like, yikes, that sounds like a terrible idea. I don't want to do that at all. But now that I've been forced to do it in different scenarios, I have found that it is not nearly as scary as it sounds. And so you and I were actually together in DC last fall, and I ended up as part of a group, and we went and spoke to our regional leaders. And a lot of times it was congressional aides. We weren't necessarily sitting down with senators and representatives themselves, and it was less intimidating to talk to someone who's a lot younger and all of that. But it really is, I think sometimes we carry this burden that, well, if I'm going to say something, I need to tell you exactly how to fix it. But I think there is just saying, hey, you need to know that people in your district are concerned about what's happening. So who in your world can actually help solve that problem? And to your point, I remember sitting in a congressional office talking to someone, and we were talking about the refugee ceiling at that time, like concern about if we lower how many refugees we accept each year. And she literally looked at us and said, I've never thought about it like this. And it was like a light bulb moment for me of exactly what you said. They have so much on their plate. And that's not an excuse that they're not addressing immigration issues, but it does mean that if we want it to be something that people are focused on, we have to step up and, like you said, be that buzz in their ear to kind of keep pressing, because that's what gets the attention. And so it's really, really important. Okay, I do want to talk about one last thing before we wrap up, because I saved this to the end so we could end on a really happy note. Because so many of us last week were celebrating the Supreme Court issued their decision rejecting the administration's attempt to end DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and offers protection from deportation for those who were brought to the U.S. as children. Can you help us understand what this decision means, and then also what's next for Dreamers?
Yeah, so it was a really important decision that we received from the Supreme Court. So many of you may know that the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals granted work authorization and protection from deportation for Dreamers that came to the United States. And there were around 700,000 individuals that were recipients of DACA. And actually, most people in the immigrant rights community, immigrant community, were thinking the Supreme Court decision was going to say that the president could terminate the program, but they decided 5-4 that the way that the president ended the program was not lawful, which basically meant that the program should and can continue. And that, I think there's a couple of things to note about the decision. I think it's a huge sigh of relief because the DACA program can continue. But the Supreme Court didn't rule on whether or not that DACA program in and of itself is lawful, which meant that the president actually said recently that he still intends to end the program, but doing it in a different way that will be lawful. Mm-hmm. And so I think the main thing for us is, we don't know when the president is going to fall through that statement and try to terminate the program in some other way. But the onus is really on Congress, because the only way to take this out of the Supreme Court's hand is to pass a law to establish some kind of lawful pathway for Dreamers to be able to earn legal status in this country and eventually become citizens. And so it's hard right now. I think when we've been reaching out to members of Congress to ask how high is this on the agenda, I think there's some members that have been thinking about legislation, but with everything that's going on right now, it's to be determined. I will say, though, that former Vice President Biden made a declaration that on the first day in office, he would send legislation around Dreamers to Congress, which is, I think, one of the few declarations he's had around what he would do on the first day if he were in office. But I think there's a lot of angst and activism going on right now to make sure Congress considers doing something soon to pass something related to Dreamers.
That's great. Yes, I think I can't say it enough that the Supreme Court decision was a relief, but we need a permanent solution from Congress. And that's the only way that we can provide stability and a lawful pathway for Dreamers to adjust their status so that they can continue the lives that they've built here in the United States, which many consider their home. And so I think that's really important. And someone mentioned in the comments, and we'll make sure to link these as well, but we have been supporting the petitions from Kind, and they also have a template for your elected officials regarding some of the issues around vulnerable children that we'll link to, as well as For Every Child is a petition we are sharing as well. So we'll put those in the comments so that you can participate in that way. And then we'll also circle back with the public comments around the asylum program. Jenny, thank you so much for your time and for all the work that you do at World Relief. We just appreciate you educating us and encouraging us. And thank you to all of you who are watching live. There's been some great conversation and resources in the comments. We invite everyone who's watching to become a part of our Women of Welcome community, where you can ask more questions and find other Christian women pursuing compassion and Christ-like welcome towards immigrants and refugees. Again, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Women of Welcome. Thank you so much for watching. Bye, Jenny.
Thanks, everyone.